London, 1891. A mysterious note arrives at Baker Street, holding a secret only Sherlock Holmes should know, and a vision in the fog that points to a boy long thought lost. This is the case Holmes could never forget. Until now. Join us as we unravel the vision of Baker Street. And before we begin, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more timeless detective mysteries. It was upon a raw March evening, when the fog hung low over the city and the dull rattle of hansom cabs came muffled through the heavy air, that I perceived my friend Sherlock Holmes to be more restless than usual. For the greater part of the day he had sat in his armchair by the fire, knees drawn up, his thin fingers steepled together, and his eyes fixed upon some point in the dancing embers. I knew from experience that such a posture denoted the working of his mind upon some knotty problem, but what that problem might be I could not discern. Presently, with a sudden movement, he sprang to his feet and crossed the room to the mantel, where he stood with his back to me, drumming upon the marble shelf with his long, nervous fingers. "You have not spoken a word since breakfast, Holmes?" said I, laying aside the medical journal with which I had been endeavoring to occupy my thoughts. "Surely you are not unwell?" "On the contrary, Watson, my health is sound enough," he replied, though there was in his tone a peculiar constraint. "It is the mind, not the body, that suffers disturbance." Before I could press him further, Mrs. Hudson entered with a single envelope upon a salver. "This came by hand, sir," she said, placing it upon the table. Holmes took it without remark, yet I observed the faintest tightening about his eyes as he noted the absence of any superscription save his name. Breaking the seal, he read the contents with a composure that was belied by the sudden flush that rose to his cheeks. Without a word, he passed the paper across to me. The note was brief, written in a cramped, irregular hand. "The matter of Limehouse is not concluded. You left one behind and he waits still. Seek the warehouse by the river." What caught my attention, however, was the small postscript scrawled at the foot of the page. "Only you will recall the hawthorn tree." I looked up in bewilderment. What on earth does it mean, Holmes? And how should the writer know aught of hawthorn trees? Holmes's gaze had turned inward, as though he were listening to some echo from long ago. "Because, my dear Watson," he said slowly, "there is but one hawthorn tree I have ever spoken of, and no living man should know the tale of it. That night, long after the fire in our grate had sunk to a red glow, I awoke to find Holmes seated at the window, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the gas lamp from Baker Street. His pipe lay cold upon the sill, and he appeared wholly absorbed in the shifting patterns of the fog that curled through the lamplight. "You are wakeful too, Watson?" he murmured, without turning his head. "I might say the same of you. You have not been to bed at all." "Sleep," said he, "is not to be had when the mind is stirred by so singular a prompting as that which I received this evening." Before I could reply, he gave a sharp intake of breath and pressed a hand to his temple. His eyes fixed upon some point in the darkness beyond the glass. "Holmes, are you unwell?" I cried. "Hush," he whispered. "It is most extraordinary." I followed his gaze but saw nothing save the swirling mist. Yet from his rigid posture I knew he was perceiving something far beyond my ken. After a few moments he rose, his expression that of one who has been startled from a reverie. "I saw him, Watson," said he, his voice low but steady. "A boy, no more than 12, standing ankle-deep in the fog. His clothing was of a cut I have not seen in years, coarse jacket, frayed at the elbows, and his hair light as the dawn. He lifted a hand and pointed eastward, toward a shadowed building by the river's bend. Then he was gone." "You speak of a dream." "It was no dream," Holmes retorted with a touch of impatience. "It had the vividness of direct observation. The image was impressed upon my mind with a clarity no mere fancy could produce." "And you believe this vision to be connected with the note?" "I am certain of it, for the face I saw was one I have encountered before, many years since, the face of Thomas Reed." "The name is unfamiliar to me," I observed. "It would be," he said gravely. "Thomas Reed was the subject of a case I undertook in my earliest days in London. A case I failed to conclude, and which, until tonight, I had thought forever closed. Holmes moved away from the window and seated himself in the armchair. His long fingers pressed together beneath his chin. The faintest shadow of regret had crept into his features, an expression I had seen but rarely upon that austere countenance. "It was in the spring of '79, he began, before I had acquired anything approaching the modest repute I now enjoy. I was living in Montague Street in those days, sustaining myself by such inquiries as chance or reputation might throw my way. The boy, Thomas Reed, was an orphan attached to a charitable home near the docks. One evening he vanished. The matron appealed to me after the police had declared him most likely run off to sea. "And you suspected otherwise?" I asked. "Most certainly. A lad of his disposition, shy, reserved, and wholly without the romantic temperament, was ill-suited for the roving life. There were other elements. His sudden disappearance coincided with reports of children being enticed away by persons unknown. I traced him as far as a warehouse in Limehouse, but there my trail grew cold. The building was then in the hands of a shipping concern whose records proved elusive, shall we say. And the boy?" Holmes's gaze hardened. "No sign, no witness, not a scrap of clothing nor a footprint to mark his passing. For all my efforts, I failed to pierce the wall of silence that surrounded the matter. It was my first true defeat, and it has lingered in my mind these many years as an unhealed wound." I could not help but note the subdued manner in which he spoke, so unlike his usual air of brisk detachment. "You feel, then, that this message, and your vision, are a summons to resume the case?" "I feel, Watson," said he, leaning forward with sudden intensity, "that the game we left unfinished has returned to our board, and this time I shall see it played to the last move." The following afternoon found us in a hansom, rattling eastward through the damp streets. A thin drizzle clung to the glass, blurring the outlines of shop fronts and public houses. Holmes sat opposite me, his chin sunk upon his breast, eyes half closed, yet I knew well enough that no detail of our passage escaped him. By the time we reached Limehouse, the air was thick with the odors of tar, salt water, and coal smoke. The cries of dock laborers mingled with the mournful calls of river steamers. Holmes led the way down a narrow lane, the cobbles slick underfoot, until we emerged upon a stretch of wharf where the timbers were black with age and slime. An old fellow in a tattered greatcoat was mending nets beside a pile of rotting crates. Holmes approached him with that easy courtesy which so often opened tongues that stubbornly resisted official inquiry. "You have weathered many a year by this river, my friend," said Holmes, offering a sovereign for his trouble. "Do you recall the warehouse that once stood yonder, some 12 years past? The one belonging to the Crayford Shipping Company." The man's rheumy eyes narrowed. I recall it well. There was talk back then, queer talk about what went on behind them doors. Children's voices heard at night, and wagons coming and going with no cargo a man could put a name to." Holmes's gaze flickered toward me before returning to the dockworker. "And what became of the place?" "Boarded up after a fire, sir. Ain't been touched since, 'cept by rats and the tide." We thanked the man and moved on. Holmes's stride lengthened, his attention fixed upon a squat, weather-stained building at the far end of the quay. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "the river forgets nothing. The past clings to these boards as stubbornly as the smell of brine. Let us see if it will yield its secrets." With that, he produced a small ring of picks from his pocket and turned his attention to the rusted padlock upon the warehouse door. The lock yielded with a reluctant snap, and we stepped into the gloom. The air inside was thick with the scent of mildew and stagnant water. A dim light filtered through broken panes high above, falling in pale shafts upon the warped planks and scattered debris. Holmes moved with feline precision, his gaze sweeping the corners, his steps noiseless despite the creak of the boards. I followed in his wake, my own eyes adjusting slowly to the murk. "Observe the dust patterns, Watson," he said softly. "In most places, a decade's worth lies undisturbed, yet here—" He indicated a stretch of floor near the far wall. "We have a faint disturbance, as though something were prized up and replaced not long ago." He went to his knees, examining the warped timbers with his lens. With a thin-bladed knife from his pocket, he worked at the edge of one plank until it rose with a splintering groan. Beneath, lodged in the narrow gap, was a strip of faded cloth. Holmes lifted it delicately between thumb and forefinger, his eyes alight with that peculiar fire which signaled the scent of a trail. Blue serge, coarse weave, and... He bent closer, inhaling. Yes, the faint trace of sea salt and tar. Do you recall, Watson, that the matron described Thomas Reed's jacket as a blue serge, mended at the elbows? I nodded. Then this is a remnant of it, he finished. Proof that the boy was here. For a moment he held the scrap in his palm, his expression darkening. Had I been less hasty in my earlier search, he murmured, I might have found this and him in time. I laid a hand upon his shoulder. You cannot reproach yourself for what was hidden so well, Holmes. Perhaps not, he said, his tone sharpening again. Yet it is clear to me now that the trail was deliberately buried, and I mean to unearth every inch of it. With that, he replaced the plank, the scrap of cloth safely in his pocket, and led the way back toward the dim light of the quay. We emerged once more into the damp, briny air, Holmes striding at a pace that compelled me to keep close at his heels. His head was bent, his gaze fixed upon some internal chain of reasoning, and I knew better than to interrupt. It was not until we reached a small coffee-house off Narrow Street that he at last spoke. Watson, said he, once we were seated with steaming cups before us, our scrap of cloth is not the only thing the warehouse yielded. While you were examining the broken windows, I came across a fragment of shipping ledger lodged in a crack of the wall, torn but still legible in part. The name E. Barrow appears beside several consignments dated the very week of the boy's disappearance. E. Barrow? Ezra Barrow, Holmes replied, stirring his coffee absently. A river man of no particular virtue in those days, later to reinvent himself as a merchant of standing in Tooley Street. His sudden prosperity coincides a shade too neatly with certain irregularities in shipping movements, irregularities the police, in their infinite credulity, overlooked. You believe him involved in Thomas Reed's disappearance? Holmes's thin lips curved in a mirthless smile. Let us say I believe him worth my time. In cases where the law's attention drifts, a private inquiry may find the truth lurking beneath the placid surface. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. But there is a danger, Watson. Men such as Barrow do not welcome a resurrection of the past. If he was party to the boy's fate, he will not scruple to silence those who dig too deeply. That being the case, I said firmly, you cannot expect me to remain behind. I should not dream of it, Holmes answered with a brief flash of warmth. Tomorrow we pay Mr. Barrow a call. Unannounced, of course. It is always enlightening to observe a man before he knows he is being observed. Outside, the fog pressed against the coffee-house window, dimming the gaslight to a sullen glow. Somewhere in its depths lay the path to Barrow, and perhaps to the truth Holmes had sought for over a decade. The next morning dawned with a watery sun struggling through the London haze. Holmes had already breakfasted when I joined him, his attire immaculate and his manner brisk with that particular energy which always accompanied the scent of game. By mid-morning we stood before an imposing house of red brick in Tooley Street, its polished brass knocker glinting in the pale light. A liveried footman admitted us into a hall lined with maritime prints and the faint tang of cigar smoke. Ezra Barrow entered presently, a broad man, his once weathered features smoothed by prosperity, though a certain restlessness in the eyes betrayed an older habit of caution. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, he said in a voice trained to conviviality. To what do I owe the pleasure? Holmes inclined his head. A trifle of inquiry, Mr. Barrow. My companion and I are engaged in tracing certain matters connected to the Crayford Shipping Company. Your name appears in some fragmentary records from the year 79. Barrow's smile did not waver, yet I noted the tightening of his jaw. A long time ago, Mr. Holmes. I doubt I can recall much of it. My dealings were all above board, I assure you. Holmes's gaze drifted, apparently idly, to a model brig upon the mantelpiece. You will forgive me, but above board is not a phrase I associate with nocturnal deliveries and the presence of children within a secured warehouse. The effect was instantaneous. Barrow's geniality froze. A bead of sweat appeared at his temple. I know nothing of children, sir. You are mistaken. Holmes's voice softened. Then you will not object if we speak further on the matter, at Scotland Yard, perhaps? Barrow's eyes flickered, just for an instant, towards a side door before returning to Holmes. There is nothing more to say, he replied curtly. If you will excuse me, I have business to attend to. We were shown out without ceremony. As the door closed behind us, Holmes turned to me with the faintest gleam in his eye. You saw it, Watson? That involuntary glance? Whatever lies beyond that door is of greater interest to our friend Barrow than our conversation was. I think it may be time to see where his own feet lead him when the day's business is done. It was near dusk when we took up our watch upon Tooley Street, ensconced in the shadow of a draper's shop opposite Barrow's residence. The fog had thickened to a yellowish haze, muffling the street lamps and lending the passers-by a spectral air. Shortly before 7 o'clock, Barrow emerged, wrapped in a heavy greatcoat, and set off at a brisk pace toward the river. Holmes and I followed at a discreet distance, keeping to the darker edges of the pavement. We had scarcely reached the second turning when I became aware of two heavy-footed figures falling in behind us. Holmes, too, had marked them. I saw his shoulders tighten ever so slightly. Keep close, Watson, he murmured. I fear our interest in Mr. Barrow has not gone unobserved. The warning proved timely. As we entered a narrow passage between two warehouses, the footsteps quickened. A moment later, a blow from behind sent me sprawling, and Holmes was seized by the collar and thrust against the damp brickwork. You'll not be pokin' your nose where it ain't wanted, mister, growled one of the men, his breath thick with gin. The other raised a cudgel, and for an instant I thought Holmes's skull would be dashed in. I scrambled to my feet and struck out with my cane, the blow glancing off the cudgel-wielder's arm. Holmes twisted like an eel, driving his elbow into his assailant's ribs and breaking free. Together we forced them back, but not before Holmes had taken a vicious swing to the shoulder that left him pale and trembling. We made our escape into the fog, not pausing until we had gained the safety of a cab stand. Holmes sank onto the bench, pressing a hand to his injury. It would seem, he said grimly, that Mr. Barrow is willing to employ rough measures to guard his secrets. I glanced at him with concern. Perhaps we should let this matter rest until the yard can be brought in. For a long moment he did not answer. Then, in a voice I had seldom heard from him, he said, Perhaps you are right, Watson. It may be that this phantom from the past was never meant to be laid to rest. The boy could well be gone these many years, and I— He broke off, shaking his head. I have nothing but shadows to show for it. It was a rare thing indeed to see Holmes's confidence waver, and the sight struck me more keenly than any blow could have done. It was the following morning, a gray, listless sort of day, when Mrs. Hudson entered the sitting room bearing a plain envelope. This was left at the door not 10 minutes ago, sir, she said, her brows knit. No messenger, and no name given. Holmes took it without apparent interest, turning it over in his long fingers. Yet as he broke the seal and withdrew a single stiff card, his entire aspect changed. The habitual languor fell from him as if it had never been. Watson, he said, look here. It was a photograph no larger than a calling card. A young man of perhaps 20 stood in a garden, the sunlight falling across his fair hair. Though the jaw was firmer and the shoulders broader, the eyes, steady, watchful, were the very same I had seen in the sketch Holmes had shown me of Thomas Reed. Beneath the image was written in an unpracticed hand, Thomas Reed, 1891. I stared. Then he is alive? Holmes's voice was low but vibrant. Alive and in London or near enough. Observe the background, Watson. Those chimneys belong to a charitable home in Chiswick. I have passed it twice in recent years. And the sender? That, Holmes replied, tapping the card thoughtfully, is the most curious feature of all. Who but the young man himself would know to bring this to me? And if he did, It was with a purpose, to see Barrow brought to account. He paced the room, the old fire rekindled in his eye. The trail has not grown cold. It is warm, alive, breathing. We must find him before Barrow does. And if Barrow already suspects? I ventured. Holmes paused at the window, gazing out upon the fog-bound street. Then, my dear fellow, we are in a race, one where the prize is not the solving of a case, but the preservation of a life. Within the hour we were in a hansom bound for Chiswick, the photograph secure in Holmes's inner pocket. The road westward was wreathed in drifting mist, the river glimmering dully beyond rows of leafless trees. Holmes sat erect, his gaze fixed on the blurred horizon, his fingers drumming lightly against his knee. "You noted the brickwork in the photograph, Watson?" he asked at length. "I did, a pale stone inset between the chimney courses. Does it signify?" "Most assuredly. That particular pattern occurs only on the east wing of the charitable home of St. Mark's. Our quarry is there, if I am not mistaken." When we arrived, Holmes requested to see the headmaster, a grave gentleman with silvered hair and an expression of habitual caution. At the mention of Thomas Reed, the man's brows drew together. "He is indeed in our care," said he, "though I cannot think why you seek him. The lad has been industrious and well-behaved since his arrival 2 years ago after—" He broke off as though regretting the words. "After escaping the custody of one Ezra Barrow?" Holmes prompted, his tone deceptively mild. The headmaster colored. "I am not at liberty to discuss his past." "Then pray permit me to discuss his future," Holmes returned crisply. "The man from whom he fled has taken note of our inquiries. If the boy is left unprotected, his safety is far from assured." At this the headmaster's reserve wavered, and after some persuasion, he agreed to fetch Thomas to us privately. As we waited in a small, oak-paneled study, Holmes stood by the window, scanning the street beyond. "We must be quick, Watson," he said in a low voice. "If my calculations are correct, Barrow will not tarry long before making his own visit, and his motives will not be as charitable as ours." The latch turned, and a young man entered, taller now, yet the same keen eyes we had seen in the photograph. He paused, regarding us warily. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I have been expecting you." Holmes stepped forward and took the young man's hand with a gravity that spoke more than words. "You did well to send me the photograph," said he. "It brought me to you before another could." Thomas Reed's gaze flickered between us, a trace of apprehension in his expression. "I thought he might try again," he murmured. "He never forgave me for slipping away." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Then we must give him no chance to act. Will you stand with us and tell your story in full?" Thomas nodded once, his jaw set. We had but begun our preparations when the sound of carriage wheels and heavy boots upon the gravel reached our ears. Holmes gave me a glance, swift and full of meaning, before opening the door to admit our visitor. Ezra Barrow filled the threshold, his features stiffening at the sight of Thomas. "So," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "the little stray has found his way back to civilization." "On the contrary," Holmes interjected, "he has found his way beyond your reach. You will find Scotland Yard far less hospitable than the warehouses of Limehouse." Barrow's eyes darted toward the door, but Lestrade, whom Holmes had summoned by telegram that morning, stepped into view behind him. "I think we'll have you on charges of abduction, unlawful confinement, and assorted offenses besides," Lestrade said briskly, producing a pair of handcuffs. "We've witnesses enough, thanks to this young man's testimony." Barrow's defiance faltered. For the first time, I saw something akin to fear cross his face. He was led away without further protest, his heavy tread receding down the corridor. Thomas released a breath he had been holding. "I never thought I'd see the day." Holmes regarded him with an expression at once keen and gentle. "You have courage, Mr. Reed. It is that, more than any deduction of mine, which has brought us to this point." 2 evenings later, we sat once more in our familiar quarters at Baker Street. The fire burned cheerily, casting long shadows upon the bookshelves, while Holmes lounged in his armchair with the air of a man whose mind had at last found its equilibrium. Lestrade had called earlier to report that Barrow's affairs were unraveling with gratifying speed. Several of his former associates had come forward, each eager to exchange testimony for leniency. The matter, Lestrade assured us, would end in conviction. Holmes listened with polite attention, but when the door closed behind the inspector, he sat for some time in silence, gazing into the fire. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last, "how a case one deems buried can rise again in so unexpected a fashion. I had resigned myself to never knowing the truth of Thomas Reed's fate, and yet—" He broke off, tapping the arm of his chair thoughtfully. "And yet," I ventured, "it was not mere deduction that brought you to him this time." A faint smile touched his lips. "No, I am prepared to admit as much. Whether that vision was born of some quirk of the subconscious, dredging up impressions long forgotten, or whether it was—" He waved a hand, dismissing the speculation. "In any case, it stirred me to act where cold logic had once left me inactive. And for that I am grateful." I regarded him over the bowl of my pipe. "It is not often I hear you speak of gratitude in such terms, Holmes. Nor will you hear it often again, my dear fellow," he replied, though there was a softness in his tone. "But there are moments when the heart must be permitted a seat beside the mind. On this occasion, they have proved excellent companions." The clock on the mantel chimed the hour. Outside, the fog pressed gently against the window panes, but within our rooms the air was warm, the tea hot, and my friend's rare contentment enough to make the close of this chapter as satisfying as any I had yet recorded. And so, with the truth revealed and justice finally served, Holmes closes the chapter on one of his most personal cases. What did you think of The Vision of Baker Street? Share your thoughts below. Your feedback helps keep these stories alive. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, so you never miss the next mystery from the shadowed streets of Victorian London.